Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. In this episode, Corey and I discuss breath control, touching on topics such as 1. The phases and biomechanics of the breath, 2. The differences and utility of various breathing strategies such as accessory, paradoxical, belly, diaphragmatic, bucket handle, and pump handle breathing, 3. The similarities and differences of using the breath for stability versus mobility, 4. Utilization of the breath for nervous system manipulation and pain control. 5. Where breath control fits within the movement continuum. If you have questions, please head over to movementprofessional.com for information on how to contact us, and we will be happy to get back to you to continue this discussion. Thank you and enjoy the episode. All right, good morning, Dr. Richards. How are you? Or it's the afternoon right now. How are you feeling this afternoon?
Feeling good. How are you feeling, Dr. Leib?
Pretty good. Maybe a little bit low on sleep. Just got back from a road trip to Syracuse yesterday. So former teammate of mine, Jerry McNamara, get his number retired. Pretty cool ceremony.
Big time.
Yeah, big time. Awesome. Awesome. Saw a 2003 team get honored, and that makes me feel real old because that's a 20-year anniversary for that. So I was like a sophomore in college then. So 20 years ago, I was a sophomore in college. It's like literally a lifetime ago.
I was in first grade. I think.
Yeah, so it's a good. We're the different generational gaps we have here. So.
Yeah,
It's the beautiful versatility in the show. So today we're going to talk about breath control. So last week we talked about postural control. Breath control is a natural segue because there's a big part of postural control is using the breath well. So we'll take as deep of a dive as we can here, but also try to keep it as succinct as we can. So I'll start off by asking you, as a newer physical therapist, but a veteran in the strength and conditioning world, and also like a veteran athlete, how have you seen breath used in your practice, and how have you seen it evolve over the time of you being like a high school athlete into a college athlete, and then now getting into the space where you're a coach and a physical therapist?
I think when I started in high school, I didn't even think about breathing, was never taught about it, probably like most high schoolers. Yeah. And then probably unlike most collegiate athletes, I feel like I actually had an athletic trainer who kind of talked a lot about breath work. Some of the systems we've both utilized a little bit in the past, like Postural Restoration Institute, some of Bill Hartman's work and things like that kind of turned me on in a way to the idea of breath work actually driving some changes within the body, and its use in both mobility and pain as well as stability too. Absolutely. Because I think really now that I look back on it, the only thing I learned about breath in high school was take a big breath in, brace, and then try to lift something. So, but right now, I think I kind of see it along the whole spectrum where we can use it to help encourage more mobility. It can be used to actually help people relax, which can in turn decrease levels of pain in the moment and decrease levels of stress. And then on the other end of the spectrum, can use it to actually create more stability when you're moving something like a heavy load. And I think it also plays a really big role. This is probably the most obvious one in types of conditioning. And we can manipulate how we're breathing to help kind of regulate the difficulty level of conditioning. And again, actually, it's almost like a stress reduction depending on how you breathe during some of those activities. So I typically look at it a lot with people in initial sessions. Anytime we're really doing a movement, checking in, making sure someone can breathe in that movement, because I think at a baseline level that tells you if they're able to actually control or sort of quote own that movement. Because if they're not, then that tells us that their body or their nervous system or their brain, which is all, I guess, synonymous to a certain extent, is perceiving that position or movement or activity as threatening or dangerous. So I think at a baseline level, that's something I look at. And then depending on their deficits, and what we need to address, then we'll use that breath further to either drive mobility, stability, or stress reduction. But that's kind of me and how I've used it in my young, short-lived practice so far. I'm sure you could speak on it a lot more, having done this a lot longer. I know you've been incorporating breath for a lot longer in your practice, so love to hear how you're using it.
So to prepare for this episode, I was actually trying to think about like when did I start using it in clinical practice, because it definitely wasn't in school that we really connected the anatomy and physiology of the breath to clinical practice. Like we learned about it, like what the diaphragm does and what the intercostals do, but it was very much specific anatomy and not tied into clinical use. And I think it was when I started looking at like the functional movement screen and functional movement systems and what they offered, they mentioned the breath at least. There was some exercises like crocodile breathing that were done as part of the overall discussion about the movement screen and what to do as an intervention after you do the movement screen. And then it started to, it wasn't very detailed though. It was almost more, you do this type of breathing to really just calm the nervous system down, and you get a overarching benefit that could be very useful to calm someone's nervous system down. And then, it was a lot of these continuing education courses, PRI, Postural Restoration Institute, definitely started to be more specific on how the mechanics of the breath actually can be tied into muscle contractions elsewhere and joint position. And that it just made obvious sense when you started to connect the dots there, but it was just interesting how long that took to be something that I thought was useful or, was able to do much with. And then now, like at this point, I just find it such a foundation of all the principles that were always talked about in physical therapy and continue to be talked about: mobility, stability, control of pain. And I think one of the reasons that it's sort of underestimated is because there's that notion that, well, we're breathing all the time, so like you're gonna teach me how to breathe. And I think there's this notion of like there's a right way to do something and a wrong way to do something, as opposed to just learning how to do something differently or getting a broader spectrum of how to learn something. And that's where with breath, and you hit that resistance from clients all the time, where it's like, oh, I wasn't breathing right that my whole life or something like that. It's like, well, no, it's like what you're here to do is learn how to do stuff better in a way. Like that, our job is to seek out your limitations and add to that, not to tell you that you were doing something wrong your whole life, but just to add concepts, add learning to things to help you because there's a deficit, right? But I do think there is that notion that it's because it's an involuntary action to keep you alive, that there's not something that you can do voluntarily to change it and to make it better, right? And you hear the same thing with walking, where if you try to actually adjust somebody's gait, there you get resistance because, well, I know how to walk. I walk all the time, right? I'm not here because I have a problem walking. Well, it's like, but that's kind of our job, is to learn about movement, and breath becomes just a movement like anything else. It's a more of a movement from the inside out, which is what makes it really important. But how valuable it can be to tie in mechanics and to tie in things in the nervous system, I can't imagine not using it now as a major part of clinical practice and a movement practice. But I don't know that I have that much more experience than you do with it, because it took at least halfway through my clinical, time and experience that I actually started using it at all.
Mm-hmm. What's crocodile breathing?
So crocodile breathing was just like lying prone, and the cueing was more about bucket handle breathing, which we could talk more specifically about what that means, but just the lower rib cage expanding and having that focus. But that's all it was. And then using the ground as feedback for the abdomen to go into the ground. But I think it was actually more to talk about the lateral rib cage expansion. But there wasn't a lot of detail about where to breathe from. It was really more just get in that position and slow your breathing down.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Well, that might be a good segue then for us to just quickly kind of go over, the different motions that are associated with breathing, with the different parts of breathing. Inhale, exhale, and then the retention between each.
Let's talk about like where how do you perceive that? Certainly we have there's 4 different parts of the mechanics of breath that I think about. We'll start with the way that you use that and how you assess that, and then I'll give my experience.
For me, I think 4 things I look at as well, which you can correct me if I'm wrong, but probably are similar to yours, which would be the inhale, the retention after an inhale, like the ability to actually hold after that, and then the exhale, and then the retention to maintain that after an exhale before a following inhale. And really the biggest thing I'm looking at during inhale is being able to see the ribs, the belly, everything kind of at the center move outwardly as you take a big breath in. And then on the breath out, everything looking to see come towards center, which would really be, again, looking at the rib cage moving outwardly side to side, and then as well front to back. I think there's a common misconception that belly breathing is the way we should breathe, which I'm in strong disagreement with, because I just think the ribs, and there's research to support this too, but just being able to actually let your ribs move is going to give you a fuller excursion of breath on the inhale and exhale, so that you're actually able to better exchange air. And the belly is going to move with that, but just trying to isolate it to one or the other is probably going to be ineffective for long-term breath control and respiratory and gas exchange.
Yeah, I would say I agree with most of that. The only thing I would add as a caveat, and just something that using the term breath control as opposed to looking at it as that there's like even an optimal way to breathe. There's sort of a response to what people are doing too much of. And for the most part, and you could let me know if this is your clinical experience too, the most common deficit that I see is that there's hyperventilation. So there's more inhales than exhales, or more breaths per minute than would be ideal, or would be controlled well, right? So the first thing we're looking at doing is just actually getting people to move their breath away from like an accessory pattern, which would be the inhale moving the shoulders closer to the neck, or getting this idea, instead of expansion being the general thing that you see during inhalation, where whether it's the belly, the ribs, just stuff going wide when you inhale versus stuff going towards a more compressive, like belly button in or abdomen inward motion during inhale. That's the first thing I usually try to combat against. And it's not because it's necessarily wrong. It's because it's involuntary. Yep. And we'll talk more about the downsides of that type of breathing, but there's a reason that people do it. So there is value to it. It's when we want to just make that clear, that there's not a completely like no value to that type of breathing. It's just that usually it's not purposeful. It's sort of a default breathing strategy, and it can be tied into things like emotional stress, and also just different postural things that we do more than other things. So for instance, both of us right now are sitting at a computer, and if the head is out in front of the body and we're sitting in a chair where our lower back is supported, without conscious thought about our breath or conscious practice, it's natural for our necks to be prioritized and be in protection. So for instance, our breath may want to protect our neck naturally. So we might breathe in a manner that's more accessory, and the accessory muscles of breathing pull the shoulders up towards the ear to pull the rib cage, the upper rib cage up. So that may happen naturally because the head doesn't feel as supported as the lower back. That's one possibility why that might happen. So I think I always like to make the distinction with clients that it isn't about good or bad. Like, you're not doing something bad. I'm not judging you for that. I'm just trying to show you more options. And then that takes us to the idea of like belly breathing. When we start to look at changing that accessory pattern, sometimes belly breathing is the first step that you would take, because we're moving the breath so far down away from the shoulders and ears, and so far away from that paradoxical accessory breathing pattern, that might be a really good start for people, because it is just teaching expansion at least, but it's teaching it in maybe the lowest quadrant to start, or the lowest ring of that. But eventually we have to do more, right? Like, we have to move that up. So it's good to see where people are and then see like what's maybe the best starting point. So I actually clinically, I will start with belly breathing, as much as that's become like a dirty term now in our field, just because it's moving far away from the paradoxical accessory breathing pattern. But I know quickly I have to show them how to move the lower rib cage, which we could look at as bucket handle breathing, because it's like two bucket handles moving away from each other. That's how the lower ribs move. We eventually then have to get up into the pump handle, the upper rib movement, which you can think of that as a front and back motion of the ribs generally. Ultimately, we want to think about the whole center is expanding outward, right? Like a 360-degree motion that we can create a cascade of pressure that moves everything outward in a kind of symmetrical way. That would be ideal. That doesn't happen for most people, and that's part of our assessment. And then when we breathe out, that we come towards compression to the center, like you said. But we have to see where people are. So sometimes belly breathing is a really good teaching tool to start. And it also, what I found is it's not great for movement. It's not great for mobility, but it can be really good for nervous system control, because it's keeping the breath so low that it is so far away from that accessory hyperventilatory breath. All right. So it's just like the idea of teaching breath control is never stuck in place as this is the best way to do it. It's really always a response to what somebody's not doing well or what they need, depending on, what they're struggling with at that time.
Yeah. And I think too, it's just like what you hit on. The biggest thing is giving people more options of how to breathe. And regardless of where you go with that, and where anyone starts with that, it's just like we want people to have these options, because you're going to breathe differently when you're doing a sprint for 3 minutes or whatever, a hard run for 3 minutes, because no one can sprint that long. And like you want to actually probably be using some accessory breathing after that, because you just need to get air in, and but then you quickly want to be able to start to bring that air and that breath down a little bit lower, like you were talking about. And I think, it just varies a lot depending on the activity that you're trying to have someone do. And that kind of leads a little bit towards using breath for mobility, which you start to hit on a little bit, and then how that actually differs for using it to create more stability, and definitely some overlap there. But I'd be curious how you're cueing that, how you're using that in different ways for either of those goals.
Yeah, so to start with the idea of using breath for mobility, I think you can look at, like we were saying, that the inhalation is broadly more expansive, or that's our goal, especially if we're trying to direct mobility, is we're trying to create that sense of the diaphragm dropping down, getting wider, and then creating a cascade of pressure outward that creates expansive, or we can think of it as a distraction type of motion at the joints. So that would be a real general crude way to think about it. But I like to, even more crude might be, say, use the breath to create space in places that there otherwise would feel like there's no more space. So if we can, use a tire analogy, right? If a tire is flat, the rim is closer to the ground. If you blow air into that tire, you give that tire more space, right? The rim more space from the ground. So that would be the concept of improving mobility in the joints, where we're using the inhale, if it could be well directed, and in a way we can get the mechanics of it, the muscular effort that's involved in breathing, which is the diaphragm, the intercostals, and there's more. So like we tend to talk about the diaphragm because that's a major driver of the breath, but it's not the only muscular element of the breath. So through breath practice, all of these muscles get stronger, just like a bicep gets stronger by doing a bicep curl. So we get this idea of we can get more out of our breath, so therefore we can create more of that space. And it's just a really hard thing to perceive at first unless you actually commit to the practice. And I think that's why it can be a difficult thing to teach, because it feels like you're doing nothing at first, because it's so subtle, until it starts to you become better at it, and it's so obvious that you now have that practice where it's like, I have to teach this to people because it's so obvious how it's valuable. But early on, someone might not be able to, they're certainly not gonna be able to feel it the way someone who's practiced can. So it can be a hard sell. So it has to be connected to movement that's more obvious to feel the benefit of. But it is to that simple, at least to have the idea that we're using it to create space if we can use it well. And then on the exhale, we're trying to, I think of it as direct our muscle contractions. That's one way to think about it, is if we can direct our muscle contractions more centrally by using that exhale. So again, if we expanded on the inhale, now we have to come back to a more relatively compressed position at the center. If we are, for instance, trying to move our shoulder, so I'm trying to reach my arm overhead into flexion, I'm moving my arm in one direction, but if I can bring my muscle contractions more to center, that also creates space. So if we think of, like the rib cage is moving down while my arm is moving up, well, those two opposite directions create space. So again, that becomes more obvious when you're more well practiced with it. But I think as clinicians, we have to be patient with people because it's understandable how subtle it can be.
Mm-hmm. I fully agree. I think I look at it or view it in a similar way there. And actually, it's just interesting. You mentioned like with our population that we work with, most of the time someone can't really feel it at first compared to someone who's, practiced with it. But it's just, that reminds me actually and brings me back to school a little bit, where we were learning about recovery after and acute physical therapy after like a sternotomy, for example, and how you actually have to learn how to use like an incentive spirometer and be able to control your breath to actually relearn how to expand your rib cage, and actually then they're able to measure that, because it is such a huge deficit after surgery that they can then measure actually just like circumferential expansion. But in our setting where we're not really seeing people in that acute stage, it's really not detectable as much for them. But in that other setting, I think it's probably so much different, and there could be benefits of trying to use certain things, taking lessons from that setting and potentially bringing it over. But generally, I think it is a lot harder to detect. I just that reminded me of that what we learned in school, which I think is just a cool parallel to draw, and that this breath control applies across all spectrums of healthcare.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because if I go back to my discussion about how we learn breath in school, that's actually a really good point, that it was taught a lot when we talked about cardiorespiratory stuff and respiratory physical therapy, but it was taught as such a specialty that it was hard to connect to outpatient therapy or orthopedic therapy at that time. But yeah, there was quite a bit of teaching about how to use positions to, move the breath for populations such as cystic fibrosis and all that. So we had quite a bit of that discussion, but it's just interesting how, if it's taught as such a specialty, you don't have clinical experience at that time when you're in school, how you can just sort of forget about it because you get into a totally different environment. So, and I think that's a really important thing to talk about is, when things are very extreme, it can be easier to see changes in a way, like in any positive direction, because you have this objective metric for, things being so limited, right? And you're using things in the hospital like spirometry, and even when we talk about like cardiovascular exercise, like if somebody has a cardiovascular surgery that they're coming back for, we're certainly going to be using metrics like blood pressure and heart rate monitoring when we're working with those people. But because it's such a specific diagnosis, it becomes obvious. It seems less obvious when you get into an outpatient clinic when people are much higher functioning, but it's just as valuable to find some of those objective metrics. So, with breath, I think it's important that you have early on, you make things more objective for people. You don't make it esoteric and subtle and too tactile or proprioceptive, where people have to feel it. but you actually give them metrics that are numbers. So I like to use like a breath hold, just to look at something like carbon dioxide sensitivity, right? So if you can hold your breath longer in a relaxed fashion, at least you get a number there that you could see change, and you can actually see that change pretty quickly. And you don't necessarily have to be in this sort of relaxed meditative state to be working on it. It's just something that you can be practicing in a bunch of different states and see it change. You can just give somebody like a count for how long can you exhale for, a box breath, whereas 3 seconds in, 3 seconds retention after the inhale, 3-second exhale, 3-second retention. How easy was that? Can you do 4? Can you up that time over time? So breath counting becomes really valuable early on because it's more objective for people, and it gives us a baseline that's outside of just, can you feel this? And can we feel the movement in our hands? So that's useful. But when they go outside of our clinical, guidance, and we don't have our hands on them, then how well are they going to do that? So I think I like to look at numbers first, even if there's a lot more to build off of later on.
Yeah, I honestly, just thinking about that, should use that more, because I think sometimes I've struggled in the past with getting into the whole can you feel this thing, and then it almost becomes frustrating for someone right away, because if they can't, then they're like, oh, am I messing up? And when in reality it's a hard thing to actually understand. So I think using metrics more like that would be really helpful for buy-in and connecting the dots for patients right from the bat if this is deemed like one of the lowest hanging fruit for someone in pain, or to actually get them out of pain, or help them along that process. So, and then you talked a little bit about like the exhale and actually further reinforcing that distraction kind of a different way. Are you cueing that differently depending on the goal of the exercise, whether it's, more of like a static exercise versus something more dynamic with more load or more force or difficulty?
Yeah, 100%. And that's like a good segue to the idea of the interplay between using breath for mobility and then using it for stability. So, for instance, like a relaxed breath should be very passive from an exhale standpoint, right? The inhale actively contracts or the diaphragm, but the exhale should be more of a recoil of the tissues from what I understand and what I've learned. But we have this ability to create pressurization of our exhale, which then again directs our muscle contractions, but it really does depend on the task. So if we're trying to just teach people to relax, we don't want to cue much from a muscular activity standpoint during that exhale. That's where manual therapy comes in a lot of times, is we may want to see their body and their anatomy direct towards a compressive side of things or towards center, but we want that to be as relaxed and as passive as possible. So positioning, gravity, like those become your best friends to try to allow people to relax without them doing too much work actively on the exhale. But if we're trying to get people to say feel their abdominals and tighten their abdominals a little bit on an exhale, because the abdominals are a muscle that helps a more pressurized exhale. That's part of what abdominals do. They flex the trunk like a sit-up style, but a big part of their function is to pull the ribs down during a more pressurized exhale. So that could be a task to just teach people how to use the exhale to feel their abdominals a little bit more. If we want someone to be the most stable, research will show you that you actually want to sort of trap that expansion on an inhale. So you're trying to use what's called intra-abdominal pressure. The inhale pushes down, creates this outward expansion in the abdomen. The ribs get wider. You want to be able to hold that expansion for the most part when shit gets hard, for lack of a better way to say it. So That's why people wear weight belts, right? Like you're breathing into the belt. You want to keep that width during the hardest part of a deadlift, during the sticking point of a squat, during maybe the hardest part even of a bench press, even though it feels very different than the center there. But the distance from the center doesn't really matter, because ultimately we're trying to use the whole body well as a cascade of pressure from the center out, no matter what task we're doing, if we're trying to be strong. So this idea of like we inhale and we expand, but we can try to actually continue to optimize that expansion even when we would be theoretically moving towards an exhale to optimize stability. But then duration of the task then really matters, right? Like if we're doing the heaviest thing, that's going to take hopefully no more than 5 seconds, right? Like that, you know, and we might be fighting for a rep for a little bit longer than that, but the idea is to push out there. If we optimize that stability much longer than that, we're going to pass out, right? It's certainly not going to be healthy for us. So we have to be able to teach different strategies for different tasks, and the variables are the duration of the task, the intensity of the task, and then how much do we actually want to just relax the nervous system.
Yeah. What I've seen like all those fail videos from scrolling on Instagram too long, where it's just like a max effort deadlift that takes over, you know, probably over 5 seconds. And then someone clearly has been holding their breath because that's the best solution in that moment to actually create that stability, and using that Valsalva maneuver. And then pick the weight up, put it down, and then it's like immediately passing out. And it's a real thing. And that's why duration matters so much, because that's going to change blood pressure acutely, blood return to the heart, and oxygen exchange as well involved with that. So that's where that duration is so important. Like if you're doing this for a longer set of more than honestly a rep, like, or even a couple reps, it's probably something where you want to learn to actually pressurize that exhale, as you were talking about, on usually the exertional portion of the lift, which would be like standing up from a chair or picking something up, or, you know, doing like the actual pushing up of a push-up or something, for example, and learning how to pressurize it, but using it just enough to get you through the movement with stability, but not too much where you're actually just restricting your ability to do this repetitively. And that's where that circles back towards, in a different way, that initial variability piece we talked about before with like the actual mechanics. Now we can think about it within variability of how much you actually need to pressurize something and being able to use it skillfully to meet the demands of the task.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll use my own personal experience here over the years to just say how many times I have been not optimized in my breathing because I was set in my ways of thinking what correct breathing was. And as I would learn something new, I would have initial resistance to learning something new because I wasn't understanding the task that was being talked about, or the intention of the exercises that were being discussed. I had this idea of, okay, inhalation is, full expansion, exhalation is towards a fuller compression. And then I learned, and I'm, continuing to learn as I get deeper into, higher level powerlifting, not higher level competitively, but for my own personal reasons, and like trying to gain more strength and to hit higher numbers, where it's like, okay, one of my biggest deficits was I wasn't keeping enough expansion during the hardest part of the lift, because I was thinking, okay, on the exhale is when I do the concentric, right? And I was mistiming when I would get more compressed, or I would get too compressed too early because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. But it worked for me when I was doing submaximal lifts, right? Like, so that was fine, right? Inhale to prepare, exhale to stand up. And then as things got harder, that's what was buckling me. The weight was starting to buckle me because I didn't have that practice for staying expanded during the right parts of the motion. And that's at this point what I'm working on the most is not thinking so much about all the cues I used to think about from a muscular tension standpoint, but just trying to maintain my cylinder, if you will, during the hardest part of the lift. And that's where, like, a lot of these different movement models, they're taught in such a way that they're comparing themselves to other models and sort of judging other models as not the right way, as I feel like a marketing strategy, right? Like our model is better. This is the way we teach it. that as you're learning, you get swept up in that, and you start to think, okay, this really makes sense. I've learned the right way finally. Yeah. And then it's not until you take more methods and you step back and you realize, okay, like all of this is valuable. I see what they're doing because they're a company trying to maybe sell a product, but as a clinician to help people, I have to actually be able to take a little from column A, a little from column B, and understand that it's all useful. It's just I have to know when to use it and when it fits and when it doesn't. And that's the thing that continues to be a process. But if I were to sort of take what I've learned at this point, and the most important thing is to stay open and not try to find a right way. Just try to have all of the elements that you can then put in place when you see that the intention in front of you, needs those elements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just from my experience with people, you do that more succinctly, or probably better than anyone, with actually just combining all those different courses you've taken, and understanding the demands of a task, and that, like seeing the actual money side of the courses and recognizing that, and that there's something being sold there, and that none of this is the be all end all, but there's these commonalities and there's these unique special things from all these different courses and models that are all useful, but it's not like one is right and one is wrong. It's just all context Absolutely. Dependent. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's so key, because you really get swept away with that. And now I think certainly my clients, I'm sure you're noticing the same thing with your clients, are getting more savvy at looking at different social media follower, like people that have a lot of followers, or influencers was the term I was looking for there, that they're saying good things, but it's just that it's really small bits, right? And that's how a lot of people get their information now. So the context just totally gets lost. And the clients are coming in with a sense of, I used to do it wrong, or other people are doing it wrong. Now I'm understanding something that I didn't understand before. I figured out what's right. It's trying to simplify the complex, because that's what a lot of influencer type of content is. And you just have to even be understanding that world a little bit, where they're not bad people. They're not wrong. That's actually a good way to get more followers. So then maybe later on you can give them more context, because they'll be interested in what you're saying. But that's not how we're going to have initial interactions with clients. They're going to be getting very small little bits of the discussion about breath. And there is this natural tendency, just like we were talking about, our early practice is like, as soon as we learned something new, we thought it was the right way. Well, that's what we're getting now from a lot of our clients. And part of our expertise has to be to say, well, slow down a little bit. Let's give you more context on that, and try to explain it and educate our clients depending on the tasks that they're actually trying to do, or what's actually useful for them.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's a good thing. It's a really good thing that they're getting this information. It's just Instagram is never going to able to be, or any of these social media outlets is never going to be the place where someone's able to tell their full story or give a full nuanced approach or take on breathing or whatever it is, because there's not really the space for it. And then also it's not the thing that's going to sell. But like you said, like that doesn't mean any of it's wrong. Just absolutely. I think part of that is the nature of the platform.
Absolutely. And it absolutely is a good thing, because I can't tell you how many times, like, I've been working with people for years, giving them my spiel and education on breath and other things that might be a little bit more esoteric. And then they see something that's, maybe 3 years outdated in the New York Post, because that's their media that they're used to getting information from. And now it starts to click and they get excited about it. And I'm like, that's great, right? Like but I'll look at it and be like, okay, that's outdated. And I used to kind of get triggered by that and say, and almost go into that where saying, okay, like this is where this is outdated. Now it's like, I actually look forward to that, is like, finally, the more quote unquote mainstream is catching up, And that's going to actually help, clients start to move the needle a little bit more, because not only are they hearing it from us, but their friends, their social group, who's also taking in that type of media, will now start to think that's important too. And I was really underestimating how valuable that is, right? Like, where you think just because your clients are coming in routinely and, and paying you money, that they're going to listen to everything you say, but it's the social group and the social context of other people wanting to do the same thing and finding that valuable, that I really think pushes behavioral change much more than we can, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's almost, it's not getting a second opinion, but it's like, it's just getting more, it's just more information. It's just getting more opinions presented in different ways, that like there's always going to be probably someone for either of us out there who comes in that just doesn't necessarily like jive with us for whatever reason, but then would get the same information presented a different way from another practitioner, and it would make a lot of sense. So it's just
absolutely,
it's more to hear similar things and then have better conversations with clients as well down the road.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that falls into the same line of just like being more open to, there's more ways for people to get education than what you have to say. Right. And trying to find the common threads, not the differences. And that's just like certainly on my end, it's just like, I gotta humble myself routinely, because, it's like you do this work for a long period of time. You feel like, okay, like I want people to listen. Right. But that's its own process of saying, well, like maybe you're not the best source of information right now, like, because you're not changing the needle for everything or moving the needle for everything these clients have to do when they get out of the sessions, right? And all of that stuff, I know we were talking about how difficult is it to just even change like the people that are in your family, their behaviors. That's the hardest thing to do, right? Because they're not in the world that we're in, right? We're passionate about this stuff, so I do look forward to the discussion of breath, even if it's not super accurate or detailed or context dependent, just being more mainstream, and then allow that education to sort of be distilled down, because people are interested. Now that's what I think where we can shine, because we have more education there. We've been doing it for longer.
Yeah. You were saying remaining open, and you can say no pun intended, but same thing with keep your airway open.
Yeah.
And breathe in many different ways, similar to how you take in information from many different places. That was a horrible stretch, but
yeah, no, I get it. Yeah.
I saw it and I had to take it.
Well, I think that's like maybe one of the last things we'll say today is like that's actually a great segue though from what we talked about last week with postural control and breath control. Because like one of the main things of why we would talk about a postural standard, and we talked about this last week, that there isn't a right posture. There's just having more control of your posture, right, in more variable ways. But one of the standards that we use is a posture that would optimize airway opening, right? Because if we can optimize the mechanics of the breath theoretically, right, like posture would matter, right? If you're kinking that tube that is the airway by being in a position that's really compressed on one side versus the other, it's putting us in a more difficult position to breathe, which then makes all the things we just talked about today harder. So you can't separate the two, right? Like to talk about posture and breath, but that doesn't mean that there's a right way. It just means that there is sort of a standard that we're looking for, but we're always backtracking from a client's baseline. So if there is no baseline and it's just general content, that's where I think people will start to look at it. Oh, this must be the right way. But no, it's just like, if we don't have a baseline, we just have to say, like, from clinical experience, here's the body of norms that we see. This is what the most people need help with, but that doesn't mean everybody needs help with. So that, again, it's just sometimes that seems like a subtle difference, but I think it makes a huge difference of why you hear these things, these wives' tales basically of saying, all right, this is the right way to do things and this is not. It's because that gets taught without an individual in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a Good discussion there. And, there's certainly more that will come up whenever we talk about movement specifically. We're going to talk about the breath in many different ways, again, depending on the context of the movement. But to come full circle to how postural control and breath control and then pain, which we talked about several podcasts ago, fit into the movement continuum. It's just that you talked about it as like you want to see if somebody can take your cues about breathing in the positions and transitions of movement. And there's different ways to do that, and there's different times to prioritize that over others, but that's got to be a big part of the assessment, just to see are they feeling really threatened by this position. If you give them a cue to breathe in the way that you would like them to breathe, can they take that cue and actually do it or not? And if not, then now you have something to work with, and maybe you have to make the exercise a little bit easier. You have to put them in a regression within that movement continuum.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that perfectly sums it up.
Yeah. I think good conversation there. I guess we'll bring this up again when we're talking more specifically about different types of movement, or just different broad categories of movement, such as strength training, speed training, endurance training. And I think we'll be hitting on breathing more specifically with those topics.
Definitely. Looking forward to it.
All right. I will see you next week.
All right. See you next week.
Later. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Movement Professional Podcast. If you're finding the information useful and would like to support us, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts. If you have questions or suggestions for future content, feel free to send us a direct message on Instagram at MovementProf. That's at MovementProf. Or you can email us directly at chris@movementprofessional.com. If you're interested in more information regarding health, longevity, fitness, and performance, please check out Dr. Leib's books, Longevity Through Movement and Mobilize. Longevity Through Movement lays out an optimal plan for staying fit and healthy as you age, where Mobilize provides a framework for improving joint mobility throughout the body. Both books can be purchased at www.movementprofessional.com/book. That's www.movementprofessional.com/book. Thanks, and see you next time.